Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. Happy Friday. Baha's here, so good morning to you, Baha. Good morning, Monica. Good morning, Ivan. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Mashid. Who else is here? Justin's here. Good morning, Justin. Krish is here. Good morning to you, Krish. Sorry. Duong's here. Good morning, Duong. Okay. Who else? Jenna's here. Good morning, Jenna. How are you guys feeling this morning? Are you ready for the weekend? Are you gonna relax, or are you gonna do you have lots of homework, or what's the weekend look like? I have lots of marking to do, so that's gonna be my job. Good morning, Karen. Dika, good morning. Okay, let's see. Karen's gonna sleep. That's good. Um, yeah, these 8 a.m. classes are sometimes a little early, right? So yeah, that's good. You should sleep in and then catch up on sleep for sure. I might do a little bit of that too. Let's see. So there's 11 of us here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay. So what we'll do today, you can keep checking in there in the live chat, but what we'll do today, good morning, Erica. What we'll do today is I will not finish talking about the social construction of race in Canada, but I'll talk a little bit more about it. And to be honest, I think because we've had a busy week, we've had a lot to do, we've had a lot of reading to do. I think we may have a short class today just because it's Friday, and I think it's okay for us to do that every once in a while. So I think we'll do that today. So I'll walk you through a little bit of the history of Indigenous people in Canada, and then, as I say, we'll finish a little bit early today because we've had a long week. We've worked hard, and I think we deserve it. So that said, I'm going to jump in here and we'll review what we talked about yesterday. So yesterday we finished talking about this academic article that we read, right? And I told you that part of the reason that we read this was to just get some experience reading academic articles. I said if you go to university that professors are going to ask you to read stuff like this, and you kind of need to know how to do it. And so what I suggested to you is that in many cases with academic papers, you can skip over big pieces of those papers because there's not, as an undergrad, there's not super important information in there. Really what you need to know is what is the author's argument and what does it mean, right? If their argument is true, if their ideas are correct, what does it mean for the academic discipline? And so that's kind of what we did here. We read through sections of the article and we determined what the argument was. And of course, you told me that Shavella Pittman argued that women of color who teach in higher education seem to experience gendered racism in the classroom, and they experience that in a number of different ways, right? Most of that gendered racism comes from white male students, and the interviews that Shavella Pittman did led her to believe that these students were challenging these professors' authority and teaching competence and scholarly expertise, and sometimes even intimidating them or threatening them. So yeah, we did a good job of uncovering what that argument was. So that was really good. I was happy to see that we did that. And we also talked about internalized dominance and internalized oppression, right? So we said that in this article we see white male students expressing their internalized dominance by undermining or disrespecting or challenging these women of color, and doing so in ways that the women who were interviewed felt that these students wouldn't challenge white male professors in quite the same way. Okay, so you know, it can be okay to challenge your professors, but in this case, these women felt that they were being challenged more often, or maybe in a disrespectful sort of way. There was some intimidation there that these women felt. We read that, and we saw that. We saw white male students perceiving the subject matter of female professors of color as not real, like not real academic scholarship, not real knowledge, and so they kind of disrespected their area of study. And again, we saw various kind of microaggressions as well. Those were kind of sprinkled throughout some of the interviews. We also said that these female professors of color may have been expressing some internalized oppression as well. And so these women felt, in some cases, fearful for their career or their personal safety. They felt disrespected. They felt that they had to moderate their behavior. They felt that they had to act a certain way in the classroom that perhaps white male professors wouldn't have to, right? And so to that end, we said that, you know, every person in authority has to balance between, you know, being an authoritarian dictator and being, you know, really, really nice. You need to sort of strike a balance somewhere in there. But we said yesterday that because stereotypically we are socialized not to see women as leaders, women often have to be more authoritative. They can't necessarily be as friendly as they might want to be, because then people won't see them as authority figures, and that usually doesn't affect men in the same way. Men can be nicer, they can be friendlier and still be seen as authority figures, or they can be more authoritarian, and people are okay with it because they expect that from men. They expect them to be an authority figure. But for women, it's a very careful balance between not being too nice and not being too authoritative. And we can talk about that a little more in the sexism unit, but I just thought I would bring it up here. And the last one is the inability to offer definitive proof of the cause of their oppression. So here what I'm saying is that as we read through that article, many of these women, they questioned whether what they were perceiving was true. And often that's the case, because a lot of when we see oppression kind of play itself out, you know, when people interact with each other, sometimes it's not entirely clear what's happening, because a lot of the behavior is happening sort of subconsciously or below the surface. And so if someone is being very racist or very sexist, that's very easy to see, right? We can identify that very easily. But in many cases, it's not clear. And so people in any minoritized group often find themselves thinking, that person was interacting with me in a certain way, but why? Was it because of my race? Was it because of my gender? Were they just being kind of a jerk? Was I being a jerk? What was happening? And many people in minoritized groups often have to question themselves about whether their race or gender or religion or whatever, whether that was a part of the interaction or not. And dominant groups usually don't have to do this. And so as a white male, for instance, if I interact with someone in a certain way, I never think, oh, did that interaction happen in that way because I am white? I never think that, and I never really have to think it. But for minoritized groups, that's often the case. They often have to wonder if their race or their gender or their sexuality or their religion was part of that interaction, whether it negatively affected it. Yeah, so okay, we talked about that article, and then we kind of switched gears and we moved on to the social construction of race in the Canada. Ooh, I gotta fix that. in Canada, not the Canada. Um, what I told you yesterday was that um, race has played an important role in the creation of Canada. I told you that when Canada was born, when we became a country in 1867, we were already a multicultural society. There were um, British settlers here, French settlers, many different indigenous people, cultures. There were Japanese immigrants, Chinese immigrants, South Asian immigrants. And so again, we were multicultural from day one, but that doesn't mean that those those non-European cultures were accepted and treated equal, which they definitely weren't. And so we were focusing yesterday on indigenous people. And again, I said yesterday that in terms of race, there are certainly many different races and ethnicities and sort of cultural heritages living in Canada. And all of those groups experience Canada in different ways. And so we were going to focus here on indigenous people, but that doesn't mean that other groups don't experience racism either, because they definitely do. But here, just to kind of to clarify a little bit of Canadian history and to keep things from getting too complicated, I was just going to focus on one group, and so we're going to look at Indigenous people. And I said to you that Indigenous people here in Canada and in the US are first peoples because they were the first people to arrive in North and South America around 15,000 years ago or so. I told you that even though we often think about First Nations people as one group, we kind of put them into one category, there's actually many, many different cultures found even just within Canada. And all of these cultures have different languages, different religions, different ways of life, different technology, different cultural values. They're all kind of related to each other, but also distinct. And so again, we're not dealing with one cultural group, we're actually dealing with quite a few. So even before Europeans came here, Canada was very diverse in terms of the different types of cultures that lived in this area. So this, of course, is the Canada that we probably know and hopefully love, that I love. But of course, it didn't really start out this way. When Canada was born, when Canada first became a country, it actually just looked like this. And so you can see we didn't have all the provinces that we have today. Ontario and Quebec were provinces, but they were not quite the size that they are today. Good morning, Jimmy. That's okay. You can see Ontario and Quebec were quite a bit smaller when they started out. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island were all part of Confederation as well. They joined Canada in 1867. But lots of the rest of what we think of as Canada today still wasn't part of the country. And so the people who founded Canada, our founding fathers, imagined that there would be a country that stretched from sea to sea, from ocean to ocean. But of course, when they started the country, that wasn't exactly what they had. They just had a small area under their control, and they wanted to expand it. However, when this whole story first starts, it actually starts even before Canada was a country. And so really, this is the way that Europeans saw the northern part of North America, so what would eventually become Canada. And so even at that time, Canada was just an area with some colonists and some settlements. There was this area called Rupert's Land, which the Hudson's Bay Company was trading in. There was this Northwestern Territory out here. There was an area called British Columbia, but as you can see, it's not a province, and it's not really the size of the area it is today. So this is really early in Canada's history, before we're a country. And I said that There were a lot of indigenous people in Canada and in North America. There was lots of different languages and cultures that were spoken here. Um, and missionaries began to arrive here in about 1600, and around the same time, traders, explorers, and later a few colonists would arrive as well. Um, and so the relationship between Europeans and indigenous people at that time was reasonably equal, or actually the indigenous people had the power, right? It was their land. There was certainly more of them. They knew how to survive here. They knew the land, and of course, European explorers didn't. And so, really, indigenous people had the power, but of course, it wasn't going to stay that way, unfortunately. So these two groups were trading for quite some time, through that time, more and more Europeans came to, British and French came to what would be Canada. So again, yeah, I said that these two groups were trading back and forth, and we have some artwork of how we can imagine this to have occurred. Here we have I'm not sure if he's British or French. I think he's British, a British army guy here meeting a group of First Nations people, right? And this probably happens very, very early before Canada as a country. If we were in class, I would sort of ask you questions about this, but maybe I'll just explain it to you. One of the things that's interesting about this picture is the perception of who has power in this image. And so maybe I will ask you, actually, who has power in this picture, and why do you say that? Who looks more powerful, and why? So who looks more powerful in this image, and why do they look more powerful? What makes you think that they are more powerful? So who looks more powerful, and why? Okay, so Karen says, okay, the indigenous people, because they have weapons and the British don't. Yeah, so the British don't seem to have any guns with them that we can see, but the indigenous people, we can see this guy in the front here has an axe. These guys, one guy's got a pipe. The guy in the far left has a pipe in his hand for smoking. The guy in the middle, I'm not sure if he has a pipe or some sort of axe. It's tough to tell. But the guys behind him have big spears, right? So yeah, the indigenous people here all have weapons, and these European guys do not. Baha says, okay, so there's a difference in numbers, right? There's this huge group of indigenous people sort of standing here, and then there's just two or three British or French guys kind of approaching this bigger group of indigenous people. Erica says, First Nations people because there's a lot of them. Yeah, exactly. What else? Do you see anything else? Do you see anything else that leads you to believe that indigenous people have more power? The other thing I might point out to you here, and this is a bit of an artistic choice, but look at the difference in the size of these figures. Okay, so there's a bit of perspective going on here, right? If you look at the European guys, they're a little bit farther away. The indigenous people on the left side of the image, they're a lot closer to us, so they do look bigger, but they actually do look quite a bit larger than the British guys, right? These British guys look really kind of tiny, and the indigenous guys look really quite large, right? Yeah, and they've also kind of got them surrounded, right? So there's this big collection of indigenous people standing here, and then there's these little British guys, and the British guys don't seem very aggressive here either, right? This guy's got his arm out. These other guys are kind of hiding behind a tree. They don't look super confident here. So this image is kind of interesting because it really shows us who has the power at this point in history. And at this point in history, it's indigenous people. They're the force to be reckoned with here. Here's another image that's reasonably old. I don't have a date for this image, but again, you can see kind of an equal relationship between Europeans and indigenous people, right? So we've got an indigenous person here on the right. He's trading some furs with this European explorer here. There's a European guy behind him just smoking, leaning on a barrel. There's an indigenous guy sitting down here smoking. Everybody seems pretty relaxed, right? Everyone seems there doesn't seem to be any tension in this photo, right, or in this picture. But again, that equal relationship was not going to last, and so what we mentioned yesterday is that Europeans brought with them a whole host of diseases: tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, and we said that those diseases had kind of evolved in Europe, and over the several hundred years, lots of people had contracted measles and tuberculosis and smallpox. Many people in Europe died, but the people who were left alive, the people who survived, they were less susceptible to these diseases. However, those diseases didn't exist in North and South America, and so Europeans brought these diseases over with them, and they were highly contagious, kind of like our friend coronavirus, but they were very, very deadly, and indigenous people had no immunity against them. And so there was, starting at that early stage, there were various epidemics of disease in North and South America, where huge numbers of indigenous people die from disease. Significant percentages of their population. And again, I said that this was particularly tragic for two reasons. One, because the death of huge numbers of people is tragic, right? But the second one was that all of their cultural knowledge was passed down orally, right? All of their stories, their religion, their language, their values, their history, it was all up here because these societies didn't really write anything down. And so to lose 60% or 70% of your community to disease means that all of those kind of skills and cultural knowledge and religious knowledge and history of your people, a lot of that gets lost because, again, it's stored up here. There's no backup for these people, and so it's devastating because a lot of people die, but it's also devastating because they lose a lot of their cultural knowledge in the process. I mentioned this yesterday, this royal proclamation, which sounded incredibly boring, but actually it's important because it was a proclamation from the king, from the British government, and he said that really only the crown, so only the British government, could acquire lands from First Nations people. And so the idea here is that if you were a British colonist, you could not buy land from indigenous people. you had to buy it from the British government. And later on, Indigenous people would use this proclamation, and still do, use this proclamation as evidence that the British government recognized that the land belonged to them. Okay, that'll make more sense in a little bit. But they recognized that the land belonged to the Indigenous people. Right, so as time progressed from the 17th to the 18th century, in the 19th century, we see increasing numbers of people die from disease. And again, these people have no natural immunity to these diseases that the Europeans brought over. Of course, this is before vaccines are invented, and so huge numbers of indigenous people die. But that wasn't the only disruptive element to their lives. One of the other things that occurred is the hunting out, I guess you could say, of bison. And so if you're wondering what a bison is, this is a bison. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, these things used to roam central Canada in massive herds. Millions and millions of these guys used to live in central Canada, and it was apparently there was so many of them that if you were watching a herd, move across the landscape, they said it was just like this moving brown carpet, and it would just, millions and millions of bison. And some indigenous people in central Canada, that was their main source of everything. They hunted bison, and they used the bison for food. They used its bones for tools. They used its skin to clothe themselves and for shelter. And so the bison basically gave them everything they needed to survive. And so they would follow these herds of bison and hunt them. But unfortunately, these things were a problem for the Canadian government. First of all, because you can't set up farms and have millions of these guys tromping all over your farm, right? They'll destroy it all. And the second problem is that indigenous people were sustaining themselves on these bison. This was allowing them to continue to practice their lifestyle. And so what you saw was people being paid to hunt these bison. And so in a very short period, the bison were almost hunted to extinction. And so if you go to central Canada today, you'll find that there are very, very few bison. Most of them live in national parks. So if you go to Banff National Park in Alberta, they've just introduced some bison to that park. Elk Island National Park in Alberta has some bison. Wood Buffalo National Park has a bunch of bison. But there's actually, effectively, there's none left. There's really no wild bison left, when at one time these guys were everywhere in central Canada. And so I'll back up. So these animals were basically hunted out. They were hunted out to make sure that there was no, so that there was room to start farms in central Canada, because you can't have bison stomping all over your farms. But again, it also created a situation where indigenous people could not survive. They couldn't practice their lifestyle because the one thing that they relied on was now gone. And you can see, I'm not sure if you can tell from the picture here, but these guys are standing on a mountain of bison skulls. And so there's lots of pictures like this from this time period, where people just hunted them all out, and now they're gone. So here's where the power is starting to shift. Okay, indigenous people were suffering, and they were suffering for a number of reasons. Number one, we mentioned that they were suffering from disease, and so their population numbers had dropped significantly. They had lost a lot of members of their culture and of their people. in the case of Central Canadians, or Central Canadian Indigenous people, the bison, the animal that they relied upon, was gone, was hunted out. And there were more and more Europeans coming into Canada. And so, again, the power is starting to shift in favor of Europeans. And so, at this point, Indigenous people kind of saw and understood what was happening. They knew that their world was changing. They knew that these Europeans had sort of come into this land and they weren't going to leave. They knew that things really wouldn't be able to go back to the way they were. And so Indigenous people started looking to negotiate with this new Canadian government and to make a deal. Okay, so they were trying to Banamere, there's no such thing as an irrelevant question. But weren't these animals just so wild that humans couldn't control and maybe teach them how to live like other cows? Yeah, bison are... this is a good question, Banamere. It's not irrelevant. But yeah, not every animal can be domesticated. And so, cows have been domesticated, and horses and pigs. But not every animal is a good candidate for this. And buffalo are, that's okay, Caleb. Buffalo are not a good candidate for this. They are unruly. If you see one in the wild, do not go anywhere near it because they will charge you. They're not to be fooled around with. So yeah, they weren't a good candidate for domestication. And I think really what Europeans would have done, and actually what Europeans did do, was they hunted out all the bison, and then they brought over their own European cows that were already domesticated, and they started to use those. And so the cows that we have here in Canada today, the ones for meat or the ones for milk, those are all imported from Europe, where they were domesticated hundreds and hundreds of years ago. The domestication process for the bison would have been a long one, and again, I'm not sure if you could have domesticated them, because not all species are good. They're not good candidates for domestication. So I see where you're going with this, but I'm not sure that they would have been able to do it. And certainly it was much easier just to kill them all off and then bring in the domestic cows that they already had. But that is a good question. Not irrelevant. Definitely not irrelevant. So yes, so Indigenous people saw that the world was changing, and they knew that they had to sort of cut a deal. They had to make sure that they had some power within this new kind of country that was evolving. Why don't they just leave them in the jungles, or so? I don't know what we're leaving. I don't know what we're leaving in the jungles. Maybe you can clarify that for me. I'll keep going, but you can type more, and I'll try and answer it there, Vanamere. So Indigenous people start to enter into these treaties. And so a treaty is basically an agreement or a contract that Indigenous people start to sign with the Canadian government. And so there's lots and lots of treaties across Canada. In Central Canada, there are 11 treaties. So 11 groups of Indigenous people signed agreements with the Canadian government, exchanging territory, their sort of traditional territory, for various forms of assistance, and so and guarantee of their rights. So when Indigenous people went into these negotiations, this is what they were looking for. Okay, so Indigenous people wanted to ensure that their people would survive. They wanted to establish peaceful relations and an atmosphere of respect. So they wanted to create a relationship with the Canadian government so that they could continue to coexist and to work together. Again, they wanted to make sure that their cultural and spiritual lifestyle would be preserved. So they wanted to be able to pass on their culture to their next generations and keep their spiritual spiritual experience alive. And again, they wanted to transition to a new way of living. So again, the way that Indigenous people had been living in Canada for thousands of years, they understood that that was about to change, and so they needed to be prepared for that. This is a very common symbol of the idea that First Nations people had, and it's called a wampum. And it's kind of like a belt, if you will. It's a long belt, and it's kind of made with a bunch of beads. And so you can see here, there's it's this white belt, and it's got two kind of blue lines here. And so, what do you think? What do you think these blue lines symbolize? What do you think? What do you think the blue lines symbolize? Karen says rivers. Yeah, exactly. So on this 2-row wampum, I think, which is called, yeah, there are two blue lines that symbolize rivers. And the idea here, the Indigenous people who created this felt that, okay, this is how we'll work. There'll be two rivers. Indigenous people will paddle their canoe. They'll paddle their boat down one river. European Canadians can paddle their canoe down their river, and we're kind of going in the same direction, but we're not interfering with each other, right? Each of us are paddling our own boat. We're both going in the same direction, but we're also doing our own thing, right? So Indigenous people are imagining kind of two different nations within the same area, and each group gets to do its own thing. Europeans can live the way they want to live. Indigenous people can live the way they want to live. And so that was kind of the approach that Indigenous people were taking, and it's symbolized very well with this wampum here. However, that's not really what the Canadian government was trying to do. The Canadian government was trying to acquire legal title to the land. Okay, so they wanted to buy the land from Indigenous people. Now, that was a problem right out of the gate, because in the cultures we come from today and in Canada today, land ownership is, we're all very used to the concept of land ownership, right? People own land, you own your house, you buy your house. That's a very common thing. We sell, we buy, there's a real estate market. That's very common for all of us, and none of us think it's very strange. But for Indigenous people here in Canada and almost anywhere you go in the world, original kind of hunting and gathering, foraging people don't really have the belief that you can own land. And so most Indigenous people, most hunter-gatherers feel that they actually belong to the land, that they're part of the land, that the land is kind of like their mother. The land kind of takes care of them. And so you can't own your mother, right? You can't own your mother. You certainly can't sell your mother. That doesn't make any sense. At least I hope not. So for the same token, or by the same token, for Indigenous people, ownership of land made no sense, right? Like, how can you own land? That there's no way to do that in that culture. Of course, in European culture, it's very common, right? We're very used to owning land and selling and buying. And so, again, that's what the Canadian government wanted to do. They wanted to buy the land from Indigenous people, but at the same time, Indigenous people had no conception of land ownership. The Canadian government wanted to buy this land so that they could settle the West. I said earlier that our founding fathers, our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, he envisioned a country that stretched from sea to sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so they had to bring a lot of immigrants in, mostly from Europe, to live in central Canada. And they were worried if they didn't, that Americans who were kind of settling the western part of their own country at the time would come north and sort of poke their way into Canada, and that would end the dream of this country that went from ocean to ocean. And so, again, this is kind of what the government was trying to do. They were trying to buy the land so they could settle it with European farmers. And so, in these treaties, what was supposed to happen is that First Nations people were to give up large areas of their land to the Crown, so to the Canadian government. And in exchange, the Canadian government was supposed to provide First Nations people with all of these things. So specific land set aside for them, farm equipment, animals, annual payments, education, we'll come back to that one, ammunition for their guns, clothing, and to preserve their right to hunt and to fish on their traditional land. So that was supposed to be what the deal was. But again, when the final version of these treaties came back, in many cases, the things that they had negotiated and agreed to were not in the contract. And part of the problem here as well was not just the idea of not being able to own land for Indigenous people, but the other part of the problem was that none of these Indigenous people were literate, right? There was Indigenous people didn't write anything down, and so none of them could actually read the contract for themselves, and so it became very difficult to establish what was in the contract and what wasn't, because they couldn't read it. They needed some assistance to do that, and so I'm just going to skip over that. So basically, many of these agreements were signed, particularly in central Canada, and after that, things really went downhill for Indigenous people. Okay, after those treaties were signed, after Canada became a country, Canada passed the Indian Act, and so the Indian Act is a piece of legislation, so it's a law kind of thing, and what's the word I'm looking for here? It structures all aspects of Indigenous people's lives in Canada, okay? And it's important to remember here that even though Indigenous people helped to negotiate the treaties, the agreements with the Canadian government, the Indian Act was not made with their consultation. And so the Canadian government passed it, and then it was enforced on Indigenous people. Indigenous people had no say in it. And what it did was, it was basically a tool of assimilation, okay? So it was a law that structured the lives of Indigenous people, that controlled them in various ways, and the end result of that control was, or the desired result of that act was, that Indigenous people would disappear, that they would be absorbed into the Canadian public, that they would stop kind of practicing their traditional lifestyle and their traditional culture, and they would just be assimilated into the group. And so the Indian Act was a tool of assimilation. It was an attempt to try to destroy the culture of First Nations people and assimilate First Nations people into Canada. Okay. And it's pretty clearly stated here and in this rather horrible statement. And so this guy here, Duncan Campbell Scott, he's the Department of Indian Affairs, or Superintendent of Department of Indian Affairs in 1893. So he's the guy that's in charge of the relationship between First Nations people and the Canadian government. And what does he say? He says he wants to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole objective of this bill. So you can pretty clearly see exactly what the government is trying to do, right? They want First Nations people to go away somehow, right? There's this idea that they're in the way of progress, they're in the way of creating this white Christian country that Canada's founding fathers wanted to create. And so the Indian Act is an attempt to make them go away somehow, okay? And so again, the Indian Act is full of extra regulations that they have to follow. There are bans on their ritual practices and religious practices. There are bans on them wearing their traditional clothes without a permit. Later on, they can't leave their traditional lands without permission from their Indian agent. There's all kinds of restrictions in this Indian Act, and of course, keep in mind that none of those rules apply to non-Indigenous Canadians. Okay, so it is very, very clear structural racism. There are a bunch of laws, and it only applies to one group of people in Canada. Okay, and it applies to them so that eventually they will be assimilated. So eventually they will forget about their own culture and lifestyle and adopt the lifestyle of European Canadians. And here you see it spelled out very, very clearly, right? This is what the government is trying to do. So the Indian Act was designed to abolish First Nation status as an independent, self-governing people by creating rules for membership, by abolishing their political systems, by banning their spiritual activities, and creating Indian residential schools. And so these schools are infamous at this point in Canada. I suspect maybe I'll just ask you that question. So who's actually heard of Indian residential schools before? Either in the news or in other classes you may have taken. Who's heard of these things before? See, so Casey, you've heard of them. Karen's heard of them. Eric has heard of them. Mashid has heard of them. And the fact that you have is a good thing. Indian residential schools are an awful chapter in the history of Canada. And for a long time, it was a chapter of Canadian history that we did not hear about. Where should I start with this? When I was in school, when I was taking social studies and Canadian history and things like this, the Indigenous experience, First Nations experience, was something that we really didn't talk about. And so for us, as kids learning this story, we learned that Europeans came to Canada, came to North America, they traded for furs with First Nations people, and then they kind of built this great country called Canada, and Indigenous people kind of disappeared off the story, and we kind of never heard from them again. And the reason we never heard from them again in the story was because a lot of awful things happen to them, right? And we've talked about some of them already. The fact that disease destroyed their populations and their cultures to some degree. They entered into these treaty agreements with the government that the government didn't entirely did not fulfill. They didn't hold up their end of the agreement. And then we see things like Indian residential schools, where these schools were supposed to provide education for Indigenous children, because that's what Indigenous parents had requested, right? So Indigenous people knew that the world was changing, and they knew that it was changing in a way that their kids were going to need certain skills to survive in this new society that was being created. And so they wanted their kids to go to school. And so in that way, these Indigenous parents 150 or 200 years ago, 150 years ago or so, those parents were really no different from yours and mine, right? Our parents want us to go to school because they know that we need certain skills to be successful. And Indigenous parents felt exactly the same way. Tragically, that's not what happened. When these young people went to Indian residential schools, they did not so much receive an education as they were brutalized in an attempt to destroy their culture, to get them to stop speaking their languages, stop practicing their culture. These schools separated them from their families. There are many, many stories of physical and emotional and sexual abuse. And so, again, we have yet another sort of tragic chapter in the history of Indigenous people, where we have disease, we have culture loss, we have bad agreements made with a Canadian government that wants to assimilate them, that wants to destroy their culture and their way of life. And then their kids are sent to these awful schools where they are, again, brutalized for simply being Indigenous. And so, again, it's a very tragic story. It's a very dark chapter in the history of Canada, but I'm encouraged by the fact that, we know about this now, right? And part of understanding racism, or part of understanding a social inequality, is looking at history, right? We said that oppression is historical, right? And so here we see we still have a very significant problem with racism and discrimination and social inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians here in Canada. And the roots of it are here, right? We're seeing decades and decades and decades of awful things happening to Indigenous people at the hands of the Canadian government. And so, again, the fact that we have a significant amount of social inequality around Black Americans in the U.S. Is historical, right? Because the U.S. has a history of slavery, and that has sort of echoed through generations. And it's the same thing here in Canada. We have a history of significant mistreatment of Indigenous people, and the effects are still present today. Noisy motorcycle. The effects of that are still present today. But that's something that I think we'll save for next week. So, that said, do you have any questions on any of that? Are there things you want to say? Banamere, do you want to tell me about the jungle thing? I didn't get that, but I'd be happy to answer it for you. Although we don't have any jungles here in Canada, but I'm not sure where you were going. What do you think, guys? Questions, comments, statements, things you're confused about, things that you're not confused about? Nobody wants to say anything? You're just going to leave me here on camera waiting for something? Casey says no questions. Okay, thank you, Casey. What else? Other things? Rashid is okay, all right. Okay, well, it looks like that's all. All right, so I will end it there. On Monday, we'll pick up this discussion of social construction of race in Canada. I have a short article for you to read. I have some video to show you next week as well. I think it's time for a little more video. I think it's been a while since we got to see one. I've got some video for you as well. And then maybe midweek next week, we'll talk about white supremacy. On the weekend, I will finish marking your papers and I'll post some grades from the quizzes. And so we'll, by the end of the weekend, you should be up to date in terms of your grades. And then, as I say, we'll continue on with Indigenous Canada and a little bit of white supremacy maybe midweek. Okay, so that's all I have for you. You are off the hook. As I say, short class today. And for those of you who aren't in my comparative cultures class, I won't see you until Monday, so I hope you have a lovely weekend. For comparative cultures people, I'll see you at 10, okay? So don't fall asleep again. I'll see you soon, okay? So bye, guys.